Hello beautiful watchers, and hello Tom Clancy. That's right, it's not just a name they put on top of video games in a desperate attempt to be taken more seriously. A common misconception is that Tom Clancy served in the military before writing novels about it. I have it on good authority that due to the nature of non-disclosure agreements, if he had served, he would have been in serious deep shit for the stuff he put in his books. The film came very close to never being made for several reasons, including casting issues and the inconsiderate end of the Cold War. Also, in an odd display of awareness, Hollywood was apparently a little worried that one of the book's biggest features, the use of shockingly accurate technical jargon, wouldn't translate well into film. But it did get made, so I get to compare it to the book. However, let's start with my feelings on them as individuals. Book first. I'm willing to straight up say that I am not who this book was written for. I have no interest in long technical explanations of the inner workings of military technology, or any fascination with the navy of any nation, or even much interest in the Cold War itself. Even taking that into account though, there were some things that bothered me about it, first and foremost being that the book lacks, in my opinion, a main character. It might be referred to as a Jack Ryan book, but Ryan only plays a major role at the beginning and the end of the story. The perspective the book is told from switches constantly without any consistency to length. You might spend a whole chapter with a character, or might switch back and forth between several every few paragraphs. You might get a new character introduced halfway through a chapter who becomes a major player in the book from then on, or you might get someone who pops up for just a short time and is never seen or heard of again. This has the easily predictable result that it's difficult for the reader to bond with any one character. If anyone other than Ryan or Ramius had suddenly been killed, I doubt it would play heavily on anyone's mind. The other side effect of this is the book doesn't really have a hero either. Ryan is important, yes, but he doesn't do much more to advance the plot than any number of other players who contributed. Another issue I had is that the dialogue sounded, and I know this is going to sound like a really weird complaint, it sounded a little too natural. In real life, if someone is being stubborn or argumentative, a person might end up having to say the same thing to him several times, or he might end up having to repeat himself for someone who wasn't in the room when the conversation started. Most authors would cut this out so it wouldn't be annoying to read, but Clancy? He sticks to it, God bless him. And in addition to the before-mentioned technical jargon, there's also extensive descriptions of the hard, stressful work it takes to operate a submarine successfully. Essentially, Clancy seems to be going for realism over excitement, and quite frankly, I'd prefer the excitement. I would like to stress that these book features are not necessarily bad things, they are just things that did not appeal to me personally. If you have even a passing interest in the Navy, submarines, or the Cold War, you'll probably love the hell out of this book. And as a film? Despite the constant jokes I heard before watching this film, in the end I didn't actually find Sean Connery's Scottish accent that off-putting. There's a moment near the beginning of the film where they do the official switchover and everyone starts speaking English. All the Russian crew now have English accents, and what you have to remember is Ramius is meant to be Lithuanian, not Russian, so it makes a kind of sense that his accent will be slightly different to everyone else's. I have to admit, the very fact that they used a switchover made me slightly nervous, as the only other film I could think of that did this was Battlefield Earth, and you know. I was very glad the film went easy on the computer-generated special effects early on, because what they did show later was bad enough to take me out of the movie a little bit. Fortunately, the practical effects and the actual naval vessels they got involved more than made up for it. The soundtrack is another major selling point of this film. It's an original score and it is all kinds of epic. Combine that with satisfyingly good performances from the whole cast and you have yourself a pretty damn good flick on your hands. Okay, let's get down to the biscuits. The film can boast reasonably impressive accuracy to the book. Captain Marko Ramius, a respected Soviet submarine captain, yes, that's how the British pronounce Soviet and I'm sticking to it, gets disheartened with the communist system after the death of his wife and decides to defect to America in their newest submarine. Said sub is outfitted with a new propulsion system that they believe will make it completely undetectable to both the United States and the Russian Navy. The sub is named Red October in honor of the Russian October Revolution. His hand-picked senior officers are all in on the plan and he intends to keep the enlisted crew in the dark by falsifying his orders from the Admiralty. A historian book writer turned CIA analyst named Jack Ryan figures out his motivation and tries to take steps to assure his success. To try to stop him, the Russians send their entire navy to blockade all of the American East Coast ports. In reaction to this, the Americans throw everything available to face them, but because the war is still cold, no one can actually do anything to each other aside from try to intimidate. This escalates quickly and causes several tragic accidents. Ryan eventually makes contact with Ramius and they team up after Ramius fakes a reactor meltdown on his ship to convince the crew to abandon it. An undercover political agent posing as the ship's cook wounds Ramius and attempts to scuttle the ship to stop it from falling into American hands, forcing Ryan to shoot him. A Soviet Alpha-class attack sub tries to sink the October right in front of the Americans, who can do nothing to help because of the rules of engagement, but fortunately, Ramius and his new combination of Russian and American crew emerge victorious. Both stories end with Ramius and his surviving officers being granted political asylum and the Red October being secretly taken into American hands to be reverse engineered. Other nice little book loyalties include, for all of the Russians' confidence that the Red October was completely untraceable, one very bright American sonar operator realized what it was and how to track it within a matter of hours. Ryan's early established terror of flying being constantly exacerbated by the multiple times he had to travel in harsh weather conditions in dangerous military aircraft. Ramius' murder of the boat's political officer because he was the only person on board who would be able to contradict the fake orders, and also possibly because he was a bit of a dick. Also, the captain's nickname of Schoolmaster, due to him having a hand in training some of the best officers in the Russian Navy. He was also always given the first command of every new type of submarine so he could write the book on how to use it. One amusing similarity was that almost every character in it was a chain smoker except Ryan, who then started smoking at the end. Hey kids, don't they look cool? Yeah, they look cool. Don't you want to look cool? Here's a fun fact, Clancy actually wrote in a reference to the true story that inspired the book in the book, which I think should have caused a meta-paradox and destroyed his universe. But that might just be me. Anyway. I thought it was a little strange that the film started with confirming that the Red October was indeed going to make it to the US coast, as that's one of the biggest question marks of the whole book. Surprisingly enough, my own personal biggest issue of the book, the before mentioned lack of main character, is addressed in the film and then some. Ryan goes from being one hero in many to the definite save of the day because of the results of several minor and major changes. It starts with everyone in the security meeting instantly dismissing Ryan's theory that Ramius is attempting to defect, instead preferring to assume he's got hostile intentions. The political bigwig only sends him out into the field to hedge his bets. In the book, Ryan successfully convinces everyone, including the president, that Ramius is on their side now, and the entire American strategy is formed based on this assumption. This new, film-only pessimistic attitude is incorporated into all the other major players of the game as well, like Admiral Painter and Captain Mansuko of the Dallas. The result of this is that Ryan becomes the one and only holdout for his theory, and has to go further and further to prove his point despite the roadblocks being thrown up in his path by everyone. Things like him throwing himself off a helicopter into the sea to get to the Dallas, something that never happened in the book. Originally, the only reason he ended up on the October was because the CIA team originally intended for this all died when their helicopter malfunctioned and crashed en route. Because he ultimately turned out to be right after putting his career and his very life on the line, Ryan is now unquestionably the hero of the hour, more so than anyone else. Ramius predicts their chances of success rather pessimistically in the film. In the book, the possibility of failure never occurs to him. His faith in the Red October, his own abilities as a captain, and the skill of his officers was so great. There's a recurring theme of submarine captains not being able to shake the belief that they are God's gift to the Navy in Clancy's work. Because the level of verbal exposition needed to explain the backstory of how Ramius' wife was killed by a drunken communist surgeon, and the lack of proper medical supplies provided by the government would have been overwhelmingly clunky, they shifted his motivation for defecting more strongly onto the nature of the Red October, i.e. that it was a weapon designed for one purpose and one purpose only, to give the Soviets the edge in starting World War III if they chose to. In the book, the senior officer's faith in Ramius was absolute, in contrast to the film where they question him constantly and he has to repeat instructions to them. Ryan's embarrassing outburst in the meeting room wasn't in the book, as the realization that Ramius was attempting to defect wasn't a spur-of-the-moment thing. It was the result of several intense hours of analysis and evidence building. Ryan, having met Ramius in the past and claiming to have a deep insight into his character and his behavior, is not in the book. This, I suspect, is another side effect of his greater shift into the spotlight. He also doesn't speak Russian in the book, not even a little bit. The science behind the Red October's new silent propulsion system has changed for the film, but honestly you'd have to be fluent in technobabble to even notice that. Both versions of the story present you with the brief red herring that Ramius might have stolen the October to psychotically launch his missiles at the US, and in both this doesn't really go anywhere. However, the way it's presented is interestingly different. In the book it's not addressed very often, but there remains the very slight chance that it's true all the way through until very nearly the end. The film makes a bigger deal out of it at first, drawing attention to the captain now having both the keys needed to fire the nukes, but then has him and his officers openly talking about their plans to defect, thus rendering the issue moot. Oddly, despite this more definitive confirmation of Ramius' intentions, in the film they still try to build tension in the scene where he and the Americans come face to face for the first time, despite the audience being clear on the outcome now. Another really big change in the film is the Russians trying to mislead the Americans into thinking that Ramius had gone rogue and bears the US before mentioned missile launchy ill will. In the book, they adamantly stick to their cover story that they're searching for a lost sub that's got some important people's sons on it right up until the very end. While it makes sense that the Russians would benefit from tricking the Americans into sinking the Red October for them, it's very much out of keeping with the mentality the Russians exhibit in all of Tom Clancy's books. Not being willing to admit weakness in front of the imperialists aside, they couldn't risk them finding out anything about the October's new propulsion system, and they had an extreme cultural emphasis on self-reliance. In real life and in the book, the Soviet Russians wanted to handle their own affairs and not be interfered with. One thing that occurred in the film but not in the book that bothered the absolute fuck out of me was the torpedo the Russian plane tried to drop on the Red October. I can see why they did it. They wanted to show off what a badass commander Ramius was as he evades it, but what you have to remember is that a huge part of the book's tension building was the frustrations the Americans and the Russians dealt with, working within the limitations of avoiding accidental acts of war with each other. That Soviet plane would have had no way of confirming without a shadow of a doubt that what they detected was definitely the October and not an American submarine, so they may very well have just started World War III with that little torpedo. The other major issue with this is commented on only briefly in the film, i.e. that a live torpedo being fired at them is a dead giveaway to the October's crew that something screwy was going on with the captain's story. I know they made a point of mentioning that Russian crews were young naive conscripts in both versions of the story, but I find it hard to believe that anyone would hear an explosion just outside their boat and accept the explanation that they weren't really shooting at us. There's really only two characters from the book that, were they real people, would feel a little insulted by their portrayal in the film. The first is Skip Tyler, who had most of his accomplishments in the book handed over to Ryan in the film, but somehow also regrew the leg he was supposed to be missing, so maybe he wouldn't have been too mad after all. The other is Captain Tupolev, who seemed like a decent kind of guy in the book, who was torn apart inside that his patriotic duty required him to kill his old friend and mentor, and came across as quite sharp and intelligent. In the film, he's a scarred, sweaty man who got himself and his crew killed at the end through his own poor decisions. In relation to this, it wasn't its own torpedo that sank the Canaveloff in the book. Ramius rammed the Red October into her side, breaching the hull. It added a better element of tragedy of the two old friends being forced to kill each other. And finally, Ryan's duel with the Russian spy was well over and done with before the Red October was attacked in the book. Presumably, they decided to overlap these two events to add more tension, which is fair. Okay, now it's time to see which bits of the novel the filmmakers felt they could straight up ignore. There's several major events that took place in the book that, while connected to the main story, didn't actually impact it all that much, as proven by the film's consequence-free omission of them. Examples include the unfortunate destruction of an unlucky Russian submarine that ran its engines too hard trying to catch up with the Red October, causing them to melt down and sink the ship. All hands were lost except for the cook, who was picked up by American rescuers. His slow recovery in a US hospital and both sides' attempts to figure out if he was a crew member of the Red October or not is represented like it's a big plot point, but again, it doesn't really impact the main story at all. There was also a short plot about a senator's aide being found out to be a Russian spy, the Russian higher-ups reshuffling power around as a result of these events, and a bunch of fleet maneuvers on both sides intended to scare the shit out of each other. This list goes on and on. There's countless stories about people trying to solve all sorts of problems, big, small, and completely unrelated to each other. The United States president is meant to be a big player in the story, but he's completely absent in the film. I have to admit, I got a little confused while reading the book, because I wasn't 100% sure if this was meant to be the real-life President Reagan, or if this was some entirely fictional president, because they go out of their way not to mention him by name. The film doesn't mention the source of the insider info the US has from the Kremlin, leaving out the book's description of the man codenamed Cardinal, a long-serving deep spy in the Russian chain of command. You know, I feel like there was something quite big missing from the film, but I can't quite remember what it was. I do remember being quite annoyed about it. What was it? Oh yeah, the Royal Navy. In the book, the Americans are caught with their pants down ever so slightly when the entire Russian Navy turns up on their doorstep, and they only have one aircraft carrier available to oppose them and to look for the Red October. Fortunately, there was a British carrier named the HMS Invincible in the area for war games, and they agreed to help defend the American coastline. Several key events like the first contact with the Red October and the fancy flying needed to transport Ryan around were British operations, but the only mention they get in the film was an acknowledgement that it was a British spy who got a look at the Red October in dry dock. America, you have to learn to share the credit for stuff real and fictional. I also feel I have to mention that despite Clancy's apparent belief, no one in Britain has said the words jolly good since the 1950s. The Dom's final thoughts. On the whole, I think this movie did a good job. There were plenty of changes, but I honestly think some of them were for the better, I really do. The book left room for improvement, and the film was smart enough to see it. That's not to say that all of the film's choices were for the best, but I feel they successfully walked the fine line between improving the story and showing respect to the book, so I'm happy enough to brand it a good adaptation. As always, my beautiful watchers, your company has been an absolute pleasure. I'm the Dom, please do join me next time.